following. So Nick Nielsen is an independent scholar from Oregon whose stories emerging complexity, especially as it relates to civilizations and its future in the context of big history. He's spoken about the future of civilization at several conferences, outside of the big history also, but also including the conference in San Rafael and in Milan with the astrobiology aspect, and the 2020 webinar being a good ancestor with scientific approaches to civilization. He's been involved with the Complexity Project. It has a couple very nice papers in there. And so, Nick, to go ahead.
Thank you, Dave. I'm waiting for my slides to load here. I've several times rebooted my computer and several times made sure I had the newest version of Zoom, and I still have a lot of problems with getting it to work, but it is displaying here. So
yeah, we're seeing you
superimposed against my slides.
Yes.
So
okay.
yeah, I hope you'll forgive me that I'm not going to do the whole, words on screen bit. I'm just mostly going to be me talking with a few images in the background.
Excellent.
Okay.
Very good.
So all sciences are founded in ignorance of what they will become, and the earliest sciences are founded in ignorance of scientific method. History is among the earliest domains of human knowledge, so it suffers from the dual burden of a foundation that didn't know what it would become and a foundation that was innocent of scientific method. History was founded in a context in which the sciences were unformed and inchoate. This is true of the other sciences that also have their origins in classical antiquity, such as mathematics, astronomy, cosmology, and biology. Mathematics and cosmology. Hold up a second. My script is seized up. Mathematics and cosmology have been repeatedly transformed by conceptual revolutions in their foundations. These revolutions have shaped disciplines with a greater self-awareness of the trajectory of knowledge and of scientific method. History as a discipline, however, has not experienced any revolution in its foundations comparable to the foundational transformations of the natural sciences since the scientific revolution, or even the social sciences since the 20th century. So history is ripe for a refounding that would set the discipline on new foundations. This is how I identify a gap in the current big history approach, which is the first of the 6 helpful guidelines that were supplied before the conference about, the first of which was identify an issue or gap in the current big history approach. The gap is the failure of history to be revolutionized by changes in knowledge that did revolutionize other branches of knowledge. The refounding of history would constitute a Copernican displacement in which historical knowledge previously understood to be central is displaced to the periphery of knowledge, and the heretofore unknown periphery comes into focus as the normative basis of history. This normative basis of history is the natural history of the cosmos entire, and to the extent that we know this as history, and to the extent that we know the history, this would result in changes both to the traditional conception of history and the implicit conception of history that's held within big history. The refounding of history should be properly understood as the origin of history as it should have been from the beginning, but couldn't have been because the conception of knowledge and science requisite to what history needs to become didn't yet exist. Today, we find history in a transitional stage between its origins as a humanistic and literary discipline and contributions made from increasingly scientific auxiliary disciplines like archaeology. Big history has been understood as a multidisciplinary effort, since we lack any other framework for integrating the humanistic and scientific aspects of history. But even before big history, The long and growing list of auxiliary disciplines like sigillography and epigraphy and numismatics had already made traditional history into an interdisciplinary effort. But the refounding of history as big history means its conception as a multidisciplinary science is replaced by a univocal science with a theoretical foundation adequate to the indefinite expansion of historical knowledge. And this is how I identify the gap in big history might be addressed by a new approach, which was the second of the 6 considerations furnished beforehand. Identify how this issue might be addressed with a new approach. So what do I mean by a univocal science? The terminology doesn't really matter. I've just picked out univocal as a convenient label, and you can call it anything you like. But univocal science, as I'm here using the term, is a science that is monodisciplinary and not multidisciplinary. The object of knowledge must possess a thematic unity and must be studied by methods that possess a thematic unity. Traditional scientific disciplines like astronomy, physics, and chemistry are univocal disciplines for my present purposes. These disciplines have passed through their own scientific revolutions throughout their history, but they've never lost the thematic unity of their discipline and subject matter. 20th century hybrids like astrophysics could be considered interdisciplinary unions of physics and astronomy, but at some point, at some as yet unidentified threshold, the hybrid effectively unifies its multiple sources and achieves a univocal status. While big history does possess a clear thematic unity of its object of knowledge, which is the entirety of the history of the cosmos, past, present, and future, it lacks a thematic unity of its methods. What's most crucially missing are the big picture concepts, comprehensive concepts that are equally applicable to the entirety of cosmological history at all times, at all places, and at all scales. The absence of a tightly bound cluster of foundational concepts is the conditio sine qua non of a conceptual framework for a comprehensive and univocal science, as all other concepts formulated for this discipline must needs hang together with these foundational concepts. How and why a science is univocal rather than multidisciplinary is a problem, the scientific basis and uncertainty of the new approach, which was the third of the 6 considerations to focus our presentations. The history of biology is sufficiently different from the other disciplines that it's worth singling out, so I'm going to talk about it for a moment. Biology has its origins in Aristotle's several books on animals, the parts of animals, the history of animals, the gait of animals, and so on. I sometimes refer to Aristotle's work as being proto-naturalistic, meaning it is naturalistic in spirit, though methodological naturalism as we know it today required almost another 2,000 years of development before it reached a stage of initial maturity during the scientific revolution. Aristotle's biology was proto-naturalistic biology, and it had to wait its turn for a scientific revolution. And it was only revolutionized in the 19th century by Darwin, possibly putting the discipline on a natural scientific basis for the first time ever. Biology was revolutionized again by genetics after Mendel and the others who rediscovered Mendel, and again by evolutionary developmental biology, or evo-devo, which was just mentioned a few minutes ago. Most recently, biology has again been revolutionized by astrobiology. So what I want to argue today is that astrobiology is what biology should have been all along, but couldn't have been earlier because we lacked the conceptual framework and the observational resources to place biology in its proper cosmological context. Instead, we had a historical sequence of revolutionary internal revolutions in the knowledge of biology that eventually brought it to astrobiology. Even when biology became a proper natural science after Darwin, the 19th century still lacked the theoretical and observational wherewithal to make the leap from proto-naturalistic biology to biology as astrobiology. So biology made the leap from proto-naturalistic biology to biology as a proper natural science and didn't make the whole leap to the end sequence of being astrobiology. Astrobiology required another 150 years of scientific development, and even now it continues to develop. The framework of astrobiology can be expanded to include within itself all of traditional biology, which is now understood to be the biology of one planet, that is to say, a specialized subdivision of astrobiology. And even if we discover no other life in the universe other than what we know on Earth, astrobiology would still be the ultimate framework within which to understand biology on Earth. With the help of cosmology and planetary science and geology, we now see the evolution on life as Earth as being subject to the immediate conditions of Earth, which formed as it did because of the conditions of the solar system, which in turn formed as it did because of the conditions of the galaxy, which of course formed because of the conditions of the universe. Biology on Earth has a lineage that takes it back to the origins of the universe, and to properly understand it, we need to trace its development through the prehistory of life and get abiotic environments of our solar system, which became an enormous petri dish for life. Speaking of physics and relativity theory and cosmology, Einstein wrote in one of my favorite quotes, quote, "No fairer destiny could be allotted to any physical theory than it should of itself point out the way to the introduction of a more comprehensive theory in which it lives on as a limiting case," unquote. This has happened with physics, as Einstein saw, but it also happened with biology. Biology on Earth is a limiting case, and it needs to live on as a limiting case within a more comprehensive theory of biology, and astrobiology is that more comprehensive biology. Astrobiology is biology conceived at the scale of cosmology, and all earlier biology has its place within this more comprehensive biology as case studies of the limiting cases that define life on Earth. Nothing was lost in the transition from Aristotelian proto-naturalistic biology to Darwinian biology, although some errors were corrected, and nothing is lost in the transition from terrestrial biology to astrobiology. But we do gain a comprehensive context that will allow us to integrate any further biological knowledge and any further biological observations of the wider universe into this common framework. The potential benefits and risks of the new approach, which was our fourth consideration for presentations, is that we benefit from a newly comprehensive perspective in which all prior knowledge can be integrated, but we risk formulating an inadequate framework that will result in epistemic stagnation or may even set us back. So this, or something like this, is the revolution that history needs, or the historical parallel to this revolution, allowing for the necessary changes required by a shift in focus from biology to history. History, like biology, was founded in the proto-naturalistic context of ancient Greek thought. The naturalism of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War has scarcely been equaled and probably hasn't been bettered by any modern history. On the one hand, that's an impressive achievement for ancient thought. But on the other hand, it demonstrates the stagnation of history since that time.
We're at
you
15
could argue
minutes. Sorry, just timer.
No problem. You can argue that history was revolutionized by Leopold von Ranke in the 19th century by methods of source criticism, but I would argue that these developments were implicitly there from the beginning of history and had already been developed by early modern historians to a certain degree. Big history should stand in relation to traditional history as astrobiology stands in relation to earlier biology all the way back to Aristotle. We could call this astrohistory if we wanted to, but there's no reason to do so insofar as that label would be confusing and that would make it a mistake. Still, a transition needs to happen, and that's the transition from big history as a multidisciplinary science to big history as a univocal science. As with biology, nothing will be lost in the transition. All history to date will be understood as local and limiting cases that will live on in the more comprehensive univocal history that is to come. And And for traditional history, there can be no fairer destiny than being integrated into this more comprehensive context, which is what history should have been all along if we had had the knowledge that we have today of the extent of the world in space and time. A conceptual revolution that institutes a single univocal framework for history is how the approach integrates with other parts of big history, most of which we can seamlessly join together, since, as I said, nothing's lost in the transition. And this was the fifth consideration for our presentations: identify how the approach integrates with other parts of big history. This won't be the final revolution in our knowledge of history or of knowledge of the other sciences. Further revolutions in our understanding of physics and cosmology could revise and potentially extend our understanding of the scope and scale of our world in space and time. If we have to expand our conception of space and time, or something analogous to space and time but more fundamental, beyond the observable universe, then our univocal history would also have to expand its scope and scale to take in this larger vision as the theoretical framework for a more comprehensive history. So there remains one interesting question here, and it's a question both in the philosophy of history and in the philosophy of science. And I don't have an answer for this question, but I want to put it out there since it's directly relevant to the sixth consideration formulated as a guide to presentations in this conference. And that sixth consideration was: identify what action might be taken to further discuss or incorporate this new approach. The unanswered question, as I see it, is whether transformation of our conceptual framework can be consciously and purposely pursued, or whether we can intentionally bring about that change, or whether a change in this magnitude in our conceptual framework is something that just happens if it does happen. To date, the greatest transformations in human history were unplanned and also entirely unforeseen. No one planned the agricultural revolution or the growth of agricultural villages into cities and the networks of cities into civilizations.
Today we have Sorry, 2 minutes.
Today, Canberra and Brasilia built from the ground up, but not all planned cities are successful, and our conception of how a city ought to be planned has dramatically changed in just the past few decades. No one planned the scientific revolution. However, once the idea of science as a systematic method of acquiring knowledge emerged from the scientific revolution, further science was and has been purposefully pursued. No one planned the Industrial Revolution, which upended human societies to a greater extent than any development since the Agricultural Revolution. But once again, once the idea of industrial development emerged from the Industrial Revolution, nation states have pursued industrial policies, although not all of these policies have been successful. Some, like the Great Leap Forward, have been disastrous. So history as a form of knowledge and as a scholarly discipline happened in a number of historical societies, and in this, it's like agriculture, cities, and civilization. No one planned it, but later historians did try to do histories on a larger scale and with greater rigor. The very fact that we're talking about how big history might develop and how it might be consciously and purposefully directed in the future suggests that some things can be done, but not all efforts at epistemic engineering can be equally successful. No scientific research program has a certain outcome. We could outline a grand program and see it fail, or more likely, see it fade into obscurity as the next big thing comes along. And that's why I say I don't have an answer to the problem of whether this approach or any other approach discussed today could be consciously and purposefully pursued. And that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Nick.
How do I turn off sharing?
I think it's up at the top. The unshare.
Do you have the 3 dots next to your name at the top?
There. You did it.
Very good.
Excellent. So see applause, and I see Ken Baskin has a question or comment. Ken?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nick. I think your conclusion is perfect.
Thank you.
In a world as complex as ours, I think the Taoists had it right. I think you can't, if you work against life, it pushes back. What you have to do is learn how life works and work with it. And I wanted to say that I think this conversation is doing exactly that, that we're trying to shape what's going to happen, and it will shape in its own time. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I've come to realize what you say about us, learning and pushing with life instead of against life. It's just been coming to me over the past few weeks that over this long series of our history where we have records, we have all kinds of great theories about how society works and how human beings work and how nature works. But when it comes to human societies and history, we we have these great ideas and we try to implement them, and some of them fail catastrophically. But there's a real hesitancy because people are personally invested in their stake in a social order or an ideological controversy, that people don't want to give that up. So we have the record of theory, but we don't, where we could regard history as an experimentation, which we try something and it fails, and then you rise and try again. There's a hesitancy to let go of the previous model and then forge ahead and say, okay, here's what worked, here's what doesn't work, let's change it, let's try this again and move forward. But that simple pragmatic veto, this doesn't work in practice, doesn't get the attention it deserves, and for all too human reasons.
Just to let you know, that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today.
Great.
Good. Keith?
Yeah, that's an excellent presentation on it, sort of summing up the whole problem. I'd like to suggest that you look into evolutionary psychology, which is a discipline that kind of organizes much of this stuff. It certainly changed my view of things. I was trained as an engineer, and I ran into the works of Tovey and Cosmides about 2000, something like that, and got much attracted to it. And I've written a number of articles on that. But anyway, it provides an organizing paradigm for looking at everything, including history, as being something that humans are evolved creatures, and this is much of the evolution of how we came about. And it's interesting because it provides a great deal of understanding of the problems that we humans have. For example, war as a response to a resource crisis or a believed resource crisis, and that actually has applications to the situation today. That's it.
Keith, could you put a source for that type of psychology in the chat?
Oh, sure.
Keith, did you say evolutionary psychology?
Yes.
Yeah, I've read a lot in evolutionary psychology, and at a previous conference we just did discuss it in some detail. Although there's always more, but yeah, I've been really profoundly influenced by evolutionary psychology. Alan McNeil, in particular, whose 2 sets of recorded lectures on evolutionary society. A lot of people have been influenced by Sapolsky as their primary source in evolutionary psychology because he has a whole series of lectures available for free on YouTube. But Alan McNeil was the guy who shaped my view.
Very good.
It's a fundamental level view of humanity and just about everything else, and it explains an awful lot of stuff that is hard to understand otherwise. I might add, though, that in some ways it's a pretty disappointing discipline because it doesn't really leave you with a lot of what you can do about things. for example,
it's a lot like reading Nietzsche. You know, you might find it disturbing, but you need to know these things. That's what I
yes,
earlier called the pragmatic veto. You might really, really, really want something to be true, but you try it and you don't work. And if you're capable of learning from your mistakes, then you do something different, go forward. If you're not capable of learning mistakes, then you just keep making the same mistake over and over again, and that's not good for you and it's not good for others.
that's absolutely true. The big problem that you run into with evolutionary psychology, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that there's nothing you can do about it. I've written, for example, on the problem of capture bonding, the business that the Stockholm syndrome is based around, what happened to Patty Hearst and Elizabeth Smart and such stuff. But if you know that if you understand it, it doesn't do you any good.
Well, it does do you in good in terms of, I think it was Buckminster Fuller, correct me if I'm wrong, who said, don't change human beings, change the environment. And that's what we can do. We can't change human psychology, but we can change the environment in which human psychology plays out. And that's, of course, changing the environment. It's a lot easier, somebody just implied in the previous discussion, to just kill people and get rid of them if they're a problem. And changing the environment is a generational task. You know, to build a new city takes 100 years at least. I mean, you can build it, but actually getting it peopled and functional, it's going to take time. And so you have to have patience if you're going to change the environment rather than trying to change human beings. But our whole history of creating, for example, a new Soviet man or a new kind of human being, that has been disastrous for humanity, and I would not want to pursue that further.
Well, we didn't have the tools to do it, and it's marginal that we have them today. But on the other hand, I happen to be one of those people who's been aware of the singularity problem for a long time. Knew Eric Drexler and a lot of that other stuff that's involved with that. But things are changing, really changing, and we're on the cusp of something very, very different.
Yes, if we change ourselves, genetically, then things change once again, and that would be a whole nother conference unto itself to talk about human speciation and selective breeding.
Well, it's a completely different thing when you wind up with control of both the programming of your mind and the programming of your it's a different world.
But it's partly a different world, but it's not a completely different world, because you're still working with that inherited evolutionary psychology. We might be able to, modify the human mind or change large parts. I mean, depending on how radical you want to be, modify parts of human nature, but you're still going to, if those, I think it was Ken saying earlier about, going with nature against nature. If you change one part of the mind and you don't change the rest of it, is that even going to work in terms of being a functional change to the human being, or is that human being just going to, write off that, minority report, as it were, within their mind, because it doesn't cohere with anything else that's going on inside their head?
The other element is that genetic engineering is not as simple as it was presented. Genes do not indicate phenotypic change. Many times there are networks of hundreds or thousands of genes involved. And what's going to happen if we start playing with it is an important ethical question.
Unintended consequences.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a whole subdiscipline in bioethics called genetic ethics. And as you point out, genetics it's not like there's a single gene for many characteristics like intelligence, height, and so forth. It's a complex of genes that interacting with nature and so on. So you're correct. We have to have a lot of trepidation. particularly distress myself about the people who want to make us live to be 150 without thinking about secondary consequences. Never mind, we'd have to work till we're 120 or something, and et cetera, et cetera.
But there are some weird things that go together that, people who breed minks, for example, know that the minks that are less aggressive have a certain look to them. And the Russian royal family before the revolution bred some tame foxes, and there's also a genetic interaction between tame foxes and their phenotypic manifestation. So they literally look different. I can't remember if it is a spotted coat or a white coat or whatever, but they have a different appearance.
It was spotted.
Okay, very good.
Just want to